I'm really glad to have you all here. And if I haven't met you before, because about a handful of you I know, I first started coming here in 1989 when I was in graduate school. I was studying for my Ph.D. in psychology at University of California, San Francisco, and just getting into meditation on my own. And a good friend of mine, Mary Gomes, who also teaches here from time to time, told me about this place in Berkeley. So I used to schlep over from the city just to take classes here. And I started off, as a student, and then went away, took my first professor job, came back in 2001. And when I came back to the Bay Area at that time, I started teaching here. And so as I said, I have an academic background in psychology. I do research on human emotions and nonverbal behavior, but I also have had this trajectory of being a practitioner and a teacher. And the last, 15 years or so, there's been a real emphasis in my work on compassion and the cultivation of compassion, which really brings us to the topic that we have at hand today. Embracing common humanity is the topic of the talk. And I hope it's clear coming into this event why it's something that we all need so desperately. Before I launch into the content of what I would like to talk about, I'd like to invite you just to kind of take a moment to kind of stabilize and be in this space, even though this is a talk and not a meditation class per se. I think it's valuable to take a moment from wherever you came from, whether you were at the chant before this or traveling from somewhere else, to arrive in this space, feeling yourself seated here now, surrounded by this beautiful art, the prayer wheels turning out their mantras. And just inviting in a slow, deep, cleansing breath. You're making some space inside, opening up. And then gradually, gently letting that in-breath go, letting the out-breath simply be a relaxation of the in-breath. If you like, doing a couple of those slow, deep, cleansing breaths, taking your time on both the in-breath and the out-breath. Really landing in your seat with that out breath, feeling your weight settle into the cushion or chair, feeling the earth beneath you. And when you're ready, just letting your breath kind of return to its natural rhythm. And opening your eyes when you feel ready. So with any talk, it's often useful to begin with a statement of the problem that's going to be addressed, or the challenge that's going to be addressed, before making an argument for whatever you're advocating. So I'm going to be advocating for embracing what's common among us, what we share. So the problem that we're addressing, or I'm addressing, is the broken world that we seem to live in, with divisions everywhere, whether people separating into multiple little groups, feeling isolated, with supporting prejudice, discrimination, bias, preferential treatment of one group of people over the other, disconnection from one another, and disconnection from the planet that we live on. And no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, there's no denying that we're a divided world. And it's really, really, I don't want to use the word seething, but it's really obvious right now in this country. The only way we're going to solve the huge problems that we face is if we can come together in some way. And coming together is challenging, but there are also ways in which we could do this. So what I want to do is explore, we have to at least be able to talk to one another without casting blame or mischaracterizing or not seeing how we are, because we have in our minds fixed concepts of what people are like. And the discussion of this is interesting because it calls on both psychology, which is a field I study. So I will from time to time be talking about some things we know from psychological research and theory about how people think and how we regard others. And it also fits really well with Buddhist psychology and the limits of conceptual thinking and the cultivation of compassion. So those are kind of fields that we're going to be, visiting in this discussion. So first, thinking about the problem, the problem of the divisions and the feelings of separateness and isolation and the difficulty communicating with one another. This can be traced, talking about the causation of this is like a dissertation, right? But there are certain areas that are useful to kind of visit. One is this whole tendency to group, because underlying all of this is a couple things in terms of the psychology of mind or cognition. One of them is bias. And these are related, these are not perfectly independent. Another is the tendency that we have to group. And I think it's useful to visit, our tendency to group kind of deeply and where this comes from, and then see how we kind of twist it in ways that can be problematic. Because I think it's important to know, because it's tempting to say, oh, it's awful, right? This is a horrible tendency we have. But I think it's also important to understand why our minds do this. That this is an evolutionarily very old thing in cognition that goes back, not just humans. We're not the only animals that group things. It makes for much more efficient thinking and problem solving to categorize. I like to give the example. I have to have more than I need to have more than one pen to make this demonstration. It's like, okay, this will do. Let's say you just came here from another planet and someone explains to you, this is a pen. This is this cylindrical thing and it's got this little metal point and there's something inside, and oh, look, if you press on it, it makes lines and you can make marks, and whether or not the marks have meaning is another point altogether. But this one has this little tiny cap with a clip. This is called a pen. And then eventually you see, oh, and this is a pen too. Start seeing they're different, right? This one's silver, this one's kind of gray, this one has a different kind of tip, but they're both pens. And then you learn about felt markers and all these different there's all these different variations. And at first it's like, oh, well, look at the wondrous variation here. But eventually, these are a pen. These are pens. And it's easier so that it's not a unique discovery every time you encounter one of these. You'd never get anything done, right? So it's helpful for us to group things as these are all alike and that those are these writing implements or whatever. And eventually, when something like this is lying around, you see it less. Like, oh, there's a pen. You grab it, right? So right there, I'm demonstrating this cognitive tendency to group things that are alike together and to learn their characteristics that define the group. But after a while, once something is grouped, and there's a lot of data on this, actually, once something is categorized, there's a tendency to see it less. you know, because we know that this is a pen and he's right, and we don't have this kind of like unique, like when you first come here from Mars, like, ooh, this looks like my ship, you know, or something. It's just, they're different. We lose that novelty, that freshness when we categorize something. And actually, this, we can think now to some of the Buddhist teachings about the limits of conceptual thinking, about how when you're bound by a conceptual thought, you know the thing by its concept rather than by the fresh encountering of its sensory qualities, you know, and a lot of freedom and wonder can come from breaking out of that. So we have grouping minds, and we tend to group. So there's that thing that that is something that supports the kind of separation among us, but it's a process of mind that is very old. So we have to learn how to see that tendency in our own minds and work with it. So that's one thing. The other thing that's also very, very old evolutionarily, because we evolved in social groups, is this tendency to do this us-them thing. You know, that was sort of important for, you know, territorial issues. You know, we're all, there's a tendency to see those of us who share characteristics. We live here, we look like this, we eat this way. This is us. That's them. They don't do it that way. And so there was some degree of protection and safety in our numbers if we have this us them. So those are old processes, but we have a tendency to, in our world these days in particular, to distort that, or shall we say, is abuse it a better word maybe? That using the convenient, you know, that there is a fear underlying it, you know, of things that are different, because we don't see, and this is where we're going to get to the common humanity thing, we don't see what's the same about us. If we have a tendency to overlook what's the same, and so we fraction, have factions, and we separate. So that's one statement of the problem. Another factor that has to do with cognition that I haven't mentioned yet, I mentioned, but I haven't explored it, and that is bias. Bias. A bias, when we talk about bias, what does bias mean? Let me ask you. Preference. A preference, that's a great definition. One, you know, for something or against something, or towards something or away from something. And it's funny, sometimes when I, one time when I put that to a group, someone brought up about fabric and how if you ever sew, fabric can have a bias, and it's sort of like the way the grain goes, and that's a great metaphor, you know. So a bias is a preference or a flavor or a tone, and our thinking has bias. And where that comes from, I mean, there's probably a small set of things, of biases regarding like safety and sensation that are probably fundamentally human, but most of our biases are learned, you know, very early in life, you know, things that, you know, who's like you, who's not like you, what your opinion is. And so the thing about biases is they work like categories. If you have a bias about let me just take something very mundane, like an everyday example of, you know, there might be somebody in your life, maybe a relative or a coworker, that you have to be around, but boy, you just set each other off, you know, that whatever you get together, it just like goes awry. For a lot of people, it's a family member, you know, maybe it's someone they work with, and you might not like it when you have to get together with them, or you're about to get into a situation with them and you feel yourself tense up, and you know, oh, I know she's just going to be this way, you know, and she's probably saying, I know she's just going to be this way, you know. And then when you arrive at a meeting, your mind is already made up. A biased mind is one that's already decided how things are going to go. And what does that do? It's like wearing, you know, those colored glasses, right? You know, the rose or blue or gray colored lenses, so that you see things in a particular way. And the interaction can become like a fulfilling prophecy, because you're bringing that energy into the situation. You're already expecting to have to be defensive, and they might be expecting that of you, and you make no progress. So biases can support the alienation between groups, the failure to see beyond the categories that we have. So that's just like a little exposition of some of the problem. There was one thing I wanted to make sure I didn't forget to say. Grouping, bias, categorizing. Okay. So socially, these things have great repercussions, right? People can, one expression of, if we think of certain cognitive structures that we form, like stereotypes, stereotypes are again, an aberration of something our minds normally do. We work with prototypes a lot in our thinking, and an example of a prototype is a very typical exemplar of a category. So if you think of something like fruit, what a prototypical fruit would be like an apple, at least for us living here. An apple is a prototypical fruit, whereas an avocado, even though we do a lot of that around here too, that's a little bit less, because it's not the sweet, juicy thing. It's a little bit out here, right? And then like jackfruit's way over here. But if you live in another part of the world, jackfruit might be much more typical than an apple. But anyway, we have prototypes get their status in our minds because of we see it a lot. It's a common exemplar, or we hear that that's what they're like a lot. So prototyping, again, that's something we do for convenience. We kind of like, oh, that's what one of those is like. So this might be a prototypical pen, right? But one with a feather isn't these days, but 150 years ago, it might have been. All right, so stereotypes are distorted prototypes that we develop for, usually is social factors, it's learning, it's values, and we're not talking about accuracy at all now, but what you're exposed to is that's what it becomes an exemplar for a group of people. And then when we think of that group of people, we think of that stereotype, which is often fed in by real behavior, mistaken notions, hateful thinking, whatever, there's a whole set of things that can go into the formation of stereotypes. But when we identify people of a group by a stereotype, we are sort of not seeing, right? We're not seeing that individual. So stereotyping and us, them thinking, so the stereotyping as a grouping and us, them thinking are things that support separateness, or as, I'm not sure if he's the first one to say it, but I've been reading a lot of John A. Powell lately, who's the founder of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. And so we think of othering is where othering supports the breaking up of a society into groups, and things like stereotyping is something that supports othering and the us, them thing, the fear of the other and putting them into that category. So we have a lot of factions, a lot of misunderstanding between groups of people, and we have a lot of othering. If we are going to solve problems, have even good conversations about what to do, and I'll just take it something which is shocking that it's politicized, but like climate change, save the planet that we live on, or keeping it habitable for us, because the earth will prevail. The earth will prevail, but whether we can live here is another matter, right? If we're going to solve these super urgent problems, we have to talk to one another, and we have to see, and we have to listen. We have to move from othering to a sense of belonging. And there are a lot of different ways to go about this that I'll get into in a moment, but I'll pause here. Any questions or comments on anything I've said so far? Yeah, reflections. Anything you think I missed so that you'd like to add? Yeah.
It just occurred to me, but implicit in what you said, that a lot of these prejudices get from our parents or grandparents, it's just handed down, and they expect think.
Right.
And so many people
I'll
never
repeat this.
question that.
Yeah.
Like they didn't form that opinion themselves. So
Right.
you learned that's how you were supposed to respond to these other groups.
Right. So to repeat the question, in case you couldn't hear it, it was that a lot of these biases or groupings that we have been passed down, not genetically, but from what we learned from our parents and grandparents, maybe where you went to school, maybe where you grew up, and they're deeply entrenched. And one of the interesting things, I want to get into, like, what can we do about these things? On a cognitive level, one of the things that's really, I find very liberating is that one of the first things that you can do is learn how to recognize your own biases. Don't pretend you don't have them. We all have biases. And we know, even if we, of all kinds, right? And even if you work very explicitly, like, this is my stance, I feel very strongly this way, there is what we now know is very profound, called implicit bias, that moves right against, like, you might have the set of beliefs that you want to subscribe to, but there's these physiologically fears of certain people that are manifest, or things that are different that you don't know about. So there are biases that run very, very deep. One of the things that's very, I'm going to get to meditation now and a little Buddhism again, but one of the ways that you can learn to work with bias is to see them, to see what you carry in your own mind, to begin to notice what your preferences, what are you drawn toward, what are you afraid of, what makes you pull back. And because a lot of these things, I used the term implicit bias a moment ago, operate below the level of conscious awareness for a lot of us. And some people, they're flagrant. For most of us, they're not. And one of the things that comes with meditation, even if you do something as simple on a regular basis as sit, relax the body and mind, rest, one of the most simple and also most profound meditations that many people are familiar with, even if you don't meditate a lot, is just sitting and letting the mind settle a bit. Find something to rest your attention on, whether it's the feeling of the breath or maybe feeling of your hands on your legs, some sensation. And we like to work with sensation because sensation's here now. Your breath is here now, the feeling of your hands on, and you use that as a reference. Do a little you're breathing, you're sitting, you're being calm. Your mind might be full of thoughts, and you come and you try to stabilize it on some little sensation, maybe the feeling of your belly moving with the breath, or the feeling of your hands resting in your lap, whatever it is. But if you keep working on stabilizing the mind that way, it'll settle. And one of the nice things about the mind settling is then the contents of mind move from this worrying thing, of like, all these thoughts that are in there. You start to be able to see what's going on. And there's this old meditation teaching metaphor of, water you got water in a glass and you got like some dirt in there and you're stirring it up. What does the water look like if you're stirring it up? It's not a trick question. Muddy, murky, cloudy, right. And then if you take the spoon out, and there's going to go like this for a little bit, and then eventually what will happen? It's the stuff settles, the debris settles, and there's actually a Tibetan saying, water when unstirred remains clear. I really would like to get the Tibetan on that. But so eventually, what I like about that metaphor is the water clears up so you can see better. If you have a stable mind, you can have better awareness of what's in the mind, because what's in the mind is the stuff that settles to the bottom. And when you look at it, you'll see, oh, it's not just dirty, cloudy stuff. There's little specks of minerals in there. There's some gems and there's some not so great things. There's the dirt, there's the gold, and a lot in between. And you can get some perspective on the contents of your mind. That's when you can start to peel down that veil and make more aware, more accessible to consciousness, conscious awareness, the things about you, things about you. And it could be, there's biases, they're the old issue, I have all these things for me from being a middle child, there's just whatever, right? And you start to get some perspective on your stuff. And as you work with that kind of awareness and a healthy dose of self-compassion, which instills a sense of humor about your stuff. Oh, there I go again, being that way, you know, you can start making a choice about who you let have the wheel, or I'll get a bunch of metaphors here, or have the microphone, you know, who's going to talk of the stuff, of the contents of your mind. So that, to go back to bias, you start learning, you start seeing your biases. You might just take, you know, if you might experiment sometime with spending a week or so. Can I notice my biases? You know, and make a note, you know, I did this in a class, you know, you start jotting it down. Every time you see that, you know, you can know, oh, there, oh, you know, with a healthy curiosity and knowing you're just human and a product of everything you've been exposed to. But you do have, you know, you can't necessarily control what you arrive at this moment with, but you can control what you do with it. And in the choice is the freedom. And that's where you can practice, you know, whatever ethical or value system you might ascribe to. If you want to let go of those biases and not let them drive, you can not let them drive, not let them have the microphone. And what's liberating about this, and it's actually the first time I kind of heard about, you know, realized this kind of thing, has a lot to do with letting go of like a classic hook or a pull that's been really reinforced. But the thing that's kind of a relief about hearing these is you don't have to suddenly be free of the bias. You got to be free this way, not hooking in, but you don't have to suddenly have it not be in your mind. That's a tall order if you've had it for like several decades, right? But you can choose to leave it over here. Or if you mistakenly and regrettably find yourself honoring it, you can say, oh, that's not what I want to do. Let go, do some reparations, and hopefully not be so quick to follow the bias again. And so that is an area for a lot of inner work, but it's also hopeful because we can see what our minds are doing and make a choice. Again, it really comes down to choice more than anything else. And what you choose has a lot to do with your value system. So that's something that I just kind of went over a lot of, like, it's cognitive psychology, but it's also very much about mindfulness of mind, about meditation, and what a difference it can make just to see what the biases are. And eventually, if, you know, and what helps you do that, by the way, is if you're doing that kind of simple, call it shamatha of the breath, you know, stabilizing the mind on the breath, that kind of meditation, not only are you practicing stabilizing the mind, but you're over and over again noticing your mind wandered and bringing it back, noticing it wandered and bring it back over and over again. And when you do that, you are reinforcing your capacity to put your awareness where you want it to be. So whenever you reinforce something, it strengthens it. You get stronger at being able to see, there goes the bias. I'm going to leave it over here. Okay, so that's one thing that's very workable that you can work with. You can start right away at noticing your biases and start working on not letting them drive. That's one thing, but it's so important to have the humility to know that you have biases and to witness what's there. It's very motivating for getting rid of it. Okay, so that's one cognitive level you can work. And if you have a questioning point, just,
You repeat the thing about
water when
Yes.
unstirred remains clear. I was at a teaching years and years ago with Sogyal Rinpoche, and I had already become familiar with the glass metaphor. And then he said that, I'm like, oh, that's like really old. That's really cool. Because, like, you know, I thought it was like a modern metaphor, but it's not. You know, the agitation of the mind. So that whole thing I just talked about was very about thought processes, and in some sense very internal, even though it might have to do with representations of other groups of people and concepts and how we think about them, but it's very much in here. Let's talk a little bit about,
So I was in the notion of implicit bias. is this notion of autopilot, that the brain is designed for us not to think. So which plays into that notion, creatures of habit, but it's in the slowing down. It's utilizing those processes of mindfulness that enable us to not operate on autopilot.
Excellent. Yes. So I don't know if you heard that comment, but what they said was that this quick thinking you're following by is an automatic process. Just like I was talking about the categorization, and you go on autopilot is sort of the antithesis of mindfulness. We can think of it as mindlessness. And the more we slow things down, that's why we start with the stabilizing, right? And taking this whatever you're stirring the glass with out so that the motion will stop. We've got to slow down to take something to shift from something that's automatic to something that is more deliberate. And we could also look at it as becoming aware of the automatic process and making a choice to right. And hopefully the idea is that if you reinforce a way of thinking that you prefer, that you'd rather follow, that fits with your values over and over again, that can become on. And eventually those biases that you don't let talk will start to fade. So that I think they can go away if you don't reinforce them over time. It's such a fascinating area, but what's exciting is I think you can make a difference pretty quickly in this aspect of your life if you start paying attention. So calm down and pay attention. So that's the start. Now, I want to get into the social grouping piece too, because that's really important. Because so far I've been really talking about things that are in our mind, our concepts in our minds, but this us, them, this, tendency, there are real problems when we group in terms of stereotyping this, but there's another process that I didn't mention before that's related to this grouping problem. That's called, that's related to stereotyping, that when we have a convenient stereotype for a group of people, let's say, we tend to see them all as this way. That's how they are. So first of all, there's the us, them language, not belonging together, being very othering, and that they are all this way. And to borrow a term from social psychology that I think is very powerful, it's called out-group homogeneity. They are all this way. That's not my people. And identifying them as just one, they're all the sameness. So what that does, and there's a tendency that the corollary of that is in-group heterogeneity, that we see, we see all the nuances and the flavors and the shapes and the ideas and the different personalities of in-group members. This is very well documented that people tend to do this about out-groups versus in-groups. And so then the challenge, and the consequence of having that out-group homogeneity and not seeing the people, but seeing the stereotype is what we might call de-individuation or dehumanization even. That not really seeing them as a person who has their own history, their own wants, their own situation, and not seeing because you're just seeing the group by the stereotype. So the only way to move beyond that is to take these separate groups and find a way of making a bigger group. And I mentioned John A. Pell a few moments ago. He talks about this bridging, that we have to find something in connection with that other group. What do we have in common? Maybe some fundamental humanity in order to go from being separate and being so different and other to all of us belonging. I'll say a little bit more about that, the juice actually about humanity in a minute, but I want to say one more thing about grouping, because there's different ways to, now we're kind of getting to solution. Once I did offer some intra I was gonna say intrapsychic, and then I mean mental processes by which we can work with bias. That I already talked about. Another thing is to, any ways we can actively work to make separate groups into part of one bigger group. Just one more thing from social psychology that I think is really powerful is there is something that this is from the late 20th century. An old colleague of mine when I was at the University of Delaware, Sam Gertner, had something he called he wasn't the first to develop this, but he worked a lot on this common in-group identity model. Now, common in-group identity. So the idea is if you can give people an identity as like to share or a framework to share, they can move from being separate groups into one bigger group. And in social psychology, they did all these experiments. And when you gave people a problem to solve that they could work on together, suddenly everybody's great, and they might have different opinions about stuff, but they're on the same team. The idea is, can we work to being on team human? That would be really great. That's sort of what I'm aiming for. I'll make no bones about it, right? So, okay, so we want to be on team human so we can have a common in-group identity. Now, one example from everyday life that many of you might have experienced or witnessed in your lives is when there's a natural disaster. Let's take even COVID when it first happened, to make sure that the younger among us can connect to this. When that first happened, suddenly when there's something that big, that was affecting the whole globe, still does, but in a really profound way, that suddenly there is some kind of uniting and helping that when we have a problem bigger than us. This is really seen with natural disasters. It was seen in the wake of 9/11 here in this country, that it's frightening how brief it is. But for that moment where there's something bigger than us, where there's something bigger or more important than our petty differences, that suddenly we're all part of the same team and we're happier, we can solve problems better, and we get along better. So that is really the challenge, So I've mentioned a couple practical, you can work with your mind to reduce bias, to see what your biases are and choose whether or not to solve them. You can work with any, I know people, some organizations, some companies that are some of the better companies, they create, team building, exercises to get people to work together on problems, to make them part of a bigger group, to try to harness that thing that, we work better in groups. It's funny, even though we have like this, I mentioned how evolutionarily old us versus them is, but guess what's really old? Groups. I mean, we are groups, we are a group species. We work better with cooperation. And this notion of the individual, it's just, yeah, there are individualist things that we do to protect ourselves or whatever, but collective cooperative behavior, not only is it our ancestral past, there are benefits for problem solving that are well demonstrated to this day. We work better together. That's why we have teams, right? This is our nature. So there's all that stuff. And now I want to get to the title of this talk, Embracing Common Humanity. But it's really important to know what we're up against. It's huge. And what the solutions are. There are tools. I mentioned working with your bias. I mentioned making two groups one. But underlying all of that is something that we can take that's on a fundamental value level, to really embracing something that's deep. And that is recognizing that in the presence of all the superficial, and I'm using that word not lightly, superficial differences among us, who we love, where we came from, what our skin color is, what our economic advantage is, how much we know, what we like to eat, what our political beliefs are, our gender identity, all these limitless things that can separate us. Underneath those things, there's something super fundamental that we share. We're all just trying to get through life on Earth, which is a huge task. That's big. We're just trying to get by, hopefully with not too much discomfort, a little joy, and the way this is spoken of, like in more traditional Buddhist teaching, is that we all want to be free from suffering and have happiness. Some people in modern contemporary context, like, well, I think I know some people who just want to suffer, so I mean, you can always spin it that way. That's why I like to go more fundamental. We're trying to get by, not have too much pain, have a little joy, be able just to be okay. And that sounds real, casual and flip the way I say that, but it's super deep. Just reflecting on that for a minute. And that's what we call what's a shared humanity or a common humanity, that there is in the presence of all the, I could say in spite of all these differences. I used to say in spite, but spite has this negative. The differences are glorious, all the shades and flavors and tastes of, humans that we have. That's not to diminish the differences. We thrive on diversity and we need it or we wouldn't survive as a species. And there's something bigger that we share. And it's hard even intellectually to argue that just trying to get by on life on Earth isn't bigger than all the other stuff, because that is bigger. It's more fundamental. So can we connect to that? And can we connect to that? And that is going to be that is going to help build those bridges. That is going to be the motivation for moving from separate factions to a bigger group. And not that we don't have our smaller groups and, whatever, but making that, have that being part of family human, not just be this pie in the sky idea, but it's a real lived experience. It'll also help be motivation for looking at those biases and learning how to let them go. So that's what I mean by embracing common humanity. There are a couple things that can support, that are connected to that can make a difference. One is, I want to offer you a phrase, and if we have time, maybe we'll just go through a brief little guided imagery meditation on it before we part today. And the phrase that I'm going to give you is not mine. I learned it from many teachers. It's just like me. Just like me. Now, and that's not to mean that we're exactly the same. I already made that point, right? But it's almost like a convenient little mantra that when you think of others, I know that they have a lot of differences. Yeah. I don't know you. I've never seen you before, but I know that just like me, you're trying to get through life. You're trying to learn. You're here. We have some shared value by you being here. You got up in the morning, you go to sleep at night, just like me. There are people in your life who are important to you. And you can look at any stranger that you don't know. You can look at people who you have challenges with. And this is where it's really important work to do. Someone, even some, maybe not like, not starting with the biggest tyrant in the world, but picking, I mentioned before this example of maybe a relative or a coworker where you just kind of hit each other's buttons, maybe them, like just like me, we're part of the same family. We're trying to do something, you're trying to get through your day, just like me. It helps erode, disintegrate those barriers that we put up of them being like this. It helps break down what's different by connecting to what's the same. It also helps build empathy. And empathy is really important for compassion. Compassion being that wish, that really being hit by the condition of others, feeling that what they're noticing, what they're going through, and being motivated if they're hurting, if they're suffering, to help free them of that. And that includes yourself, right? That way we be free. That being compassion. Empathy, that being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and know what it's like to feel awful. Like, even let's take that person with whom you have difficulty. You might disagree with them a lot. There might be something you have really different opinions about, and you always kind of clash on that, but that just like you, they don't like to feel this way either. see, that's an empathy thing. Like I can relate to how yucky it is when we get together like this, just like me, they're just trying to get through their life, and they have a belief that they really feel strongly about it, and it's different from mine. And just like me, they have people in their life who who are meaningful to them and things that they do, so it starts to build that commonality. And as an experiment, you can like walk around in the world and play with this just like me. Try it on for size. See, in this compassion cultivation class that I teach and I helped develop at Stanford University with Thubten Jinpa, who is the primary translator for the Dalai Lama. It's an 8-week compassion training program based on both Tibetan Buddhism and psychology and neuroscience, and taught in such a way to make it accessible to pretty much anybody. And my dear friend and colleague, Greg Morris, who's sitting here, is another teacher of this compassion program. We focus one whole week on this just like me meditation. And one of my favorite things is after a week of daily practice, they're practicing all 8 weeks, but this week where they focus on the just like me meditation is when people come back, like after that, they share stories, and it's great. I mean, for me, that's my favorite stuff to hear as a teacher, is not, oh, I had great meditations, I didn't fidget a lot. I mean, that's nice. But even if you have a bunch of really difficult meditations, is taking the time and sit there and working on it that matters. But what I love the most is the stuff that they just tell about their daily lives. And, invariably, I had one woman, she said, I work at grocery store, and I get so frustrated with people who come in, there was someone who came up and she was just being really nasty at me, and she was just, I just felt like, okay, here's your change, and I didn't want to deal with her, but I stopped myself and I thought, I don't know what she's been through today. Just like me, she's got a rich, complicated life. I don't know the specifics. Maybe she had a bad day. I had a bad day yesterday. And hearing that, and so I decided just to be kind. And we had a very different transaction. It's that simple. And another thing that you can do, and there's a couple things you can do and kind of take with you into the world, kind of help soften things. You can, notice your biases. You can practice this just like me stuff. You can try to bridge through groups with shared activities and understanding. Another thing you can do is be kind as much as possible. And there's this great quote from the Dalai Lama that you've probably seen on posters or whatever, be kind whenever possible. It's always possible. And I love that because kindness doesn't mean you have to like them. You don't. I mean, this is what, because people say, I can't be nice to everybody. Some people are horrible. It's not about like you have to, kindness is not weak. Compassion is not weak. It's very strong. Because compassion in particular, because with compassion, it's not just being nice. It's like, I see that they're suffering and I want to make a difference here. And it's not real pleasant to be here, but I'm not shirking from it. I'm staying, and critical, all those buts with ands, and I can be nice while I'm here. Because actually, if you're nice to somebody, they're much more likely to cooperate with you than if you throw daggers at them, right? So it's actually incredibly empowering. I think this is something like compassion activism, is to spread kindness as much as possible. Please just be nice to as many people as you possibly can. And that doesn't mean being syrupy or overdoing it. It just means being kind, because you don't know their story. You don't know what brought them here. But you do know probably that they've been through something, and we've all been, life is a tough journey. And living on planet Earth these days is not easy. So spread that kindness willy-nilly, really working on trying to soften the edges. And another saying from a great teacher, Roshi Joan Halifax, who runs the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She talks about, compassion as having a strong back and a soft front. And it's also great for meditation posture because you want to be solid, but you want to be, let that belly get big, just like everything I think as a woman, it's like, wow, I get permission to let my belly get big. It's great. But really just like soft front. And what that means is that you're feeling it. You're not putting up armor against what's going on in the world. You're really feeling it because that's important because you know what it's like to hurt and someone else is hurting and it moves you, and that is a motivation because just like me, they don't want to feel this. I know how awful this feels. And it encourages you to reach out. The strong back is that you're not shirking from the difficult stuff. The more you practice when you're doing compassion practice of actually imagining someone who, going, bringing to mind someone in your mind, whether it could be a loved one even. We often start with a loved one, who's going through something difficult and noticing that and how it makes you feel and feeling that. It can be uncomfortable, but it's also incredibly beautiful because it shows how much you care. And you have to be soft to let that in. And then the strong back, the resolve that, to do something about it, to not run when the going gets tough. That can help you be, really a warrior for helping things get better for them, for you, for all of us. So strong back, soft front, and really letting experience soften you, not harden you, which is sort of counterintuitive. But the hardening is that shell, the armor that we build up. We think about calluses that form when we use our hands repetitively. You start to not feel where the calluses are. I play guitar, so I'm touching the tips of my fingers, right? You don't feel that there. And that makes, there's something of value for it, in that you might not fall over, and we get accustomed to certain things. The more you get used to being present with suffering, it doesn't knock you down as much, but you still feel profoundly. In fact, in some ways, even more. So let's take a few minutes. We have a few minutes left. We'll do a couple minutes, and then we'll have a couple more minutes for question. But I'll just guide you through a little, just like me. And maybe just taking a couple slow, deep breaths to move from this talking, engaging mode that way to being within, inside, the space inside. Opening up and inviting in some space. Deep in breath and letting that breath, letting it go, letting your weight settle into your seat. Doing just a couple of those slow, deep breaths. And when you're ready, just letting your breath settle into its natural rhythm, letting the body breathe the way it does without you controlling it. And bringing to mind, taking a moment to try to visualize, if you can. And if visual imagery doesn't work for you, just maybe a sense of somebody, bringing to mind somebody who actually you don't know that well, but maybe whose face you recognize. Maybe it's a neighbor you see and they're watering their plants out front or something, or walking by the hallway. Maybe the most you've ever done is exchange a hello. Or maybe it's someone who works at the grocery store you go to. You know their face, but you don't know anything about them. And you probably don't even know their name, but you might. We all have people like this in our lives. Taking a moment and inviting in an image or a sense of that person. And when you've got somebody, whoever comes to mind first is fine. And if no one comes to mind, just pick someone you know. It's okay. But bringing to mind if it's the person you don't really know. Maybe you know they live on your street and that's about it. Recognize that this person, just like you, is trying to get through life. You might only see them in the grocery store, but they have a whole complex life away from that space, just like you. They get up each morning. They go about their day. They make their meals. They try to get by. They do their work, just like you. And recognizing that similarity, even when you don't know all these other details about them. Recognizing that similarity, offering them in your mind a couple good wishes. May you be happy. May you be safe. May you find peace and joy. Just some nice, kind wishes, any flavor you want. You don't have to use those words. May you be well, may you be safe, may you be healthy. May you have a good day. Recognizing that just like you, they want these things. May you be happy. May you be safe. May you have peace and joy. And maybe thanking them for showing up in your mind for this little exercise. If you're doing this later, you can do it for a longer period of time. And just coming back to the breath in the body, feeling the breathing body. And maybe wishing safety, happiness, peace and joy and freedom from suffering for all beings. May we be free. So, thank you. I do have a couple minutes if anybody has any questions, other comments. Yeah.
I think what is commonly forgotten is to practice that compassion for oneself.
Absolutely.
Start giving so much, experiencing compassion burnout because we haven't balanced it.
Right. The comment was how important it is to practice compassion for oneself. And it's so that we don't get burnt out of sending it out. And I mentioned self-compassion very briefly in the beginning, which is essential here. I think an important piece of this is that all compassion practice must include compassion for oneself. That the notion of burnout is more like when we get distressed by the suffering around us and neglect the self. And if you haven't shorn up that self-concern and self-care, then you're more vulnerable to that. For certain. Yes, absolutely. Cannot stress it enough. And it's been the focus of many a talk, but did not get into it a lot here. But thank you for bringing it up again and reinforcing the importance of it. And that's even any of these things that you do, any of these things, reinforcing, noticing one's own pain, one's own discomfort, extending to oneself the wishes for safety, freedom from suffering, and peace. and kind of letting that be the cornerstone before moving out. And then also realizing how when you've reinforced this tendency for the value of caring for yourself, I don't want to be suffering, may I be happy, may I be free from suffering, it helps you see, along with your biases and on the other thing, the things that you do that aren't kind to yourself. And it makes it easier for you to let go. So in a sense, doing anything that you might do, like even these choices to be free from bias, is an act of self-compassion. Anything, showing up for something like this, anything you do for self-care is an expression of self-compassion. And that you can kind of carry, it's a nice little thing that you can carry in your mind of treating yourself well is not an indulgence. I like to think of it as almost like hygiene. You feed yourself, you bathe yourself. How about attending to your own suffering? Right up there on that list. Any other comments or questions? Anybody in Zoom land? Hi, Zoom land. Yes.
I was just thinking, it's very hard to stay in contact.
Mary Jo. Yeah. Hi, Mary Jo.
Yeah. It's very hard to stay in contact through these processes. My understanding is we're very context dependent. And so in order to maintain presence, I tend to be there but withdrawn. But to be there and in contact in our relational, pro-social, context-dependent state, I don't know. I find it extremely difficult.
So you're talking about how you find it difficult to put yourself in contact with others?
No.
To maintain.
When you're talking about the othering.
You're right.
Etc. So you're with a group.
Mm-hmm.
It's a difficult group. And you're staying open. But in order to stay open, you actually need to separate to protect. It's actually quite challenging to maintain that relational, contactful presence.
It's very challenging and it's very complicated because underlying it is fear. Fear is what causes that armor to come up, and so one of the things that, and this is a whole separate talk too, but it's deeply related and it's important because it's like one of the things that's worth exploring is what is the fear about? Fear can happen and that's okay, but emotions are very informative. One of my favorite quotes from Tartang Tulku Rinpoche is we need not be afraid of our emotions. We need not try to abandon them. We should welcome them because we have no greater teachers about what's important to us. So emotions give us information. If fear comes up, that means there's a perceived threat, right? A perceived threat to safety or your well-being, or maybe it's a threat towards your identity. It could be more, removed from immediate physical danger. And when we can look with those emotions, so often that thing that we pull back for protection, right, is what is it that we're fearing? And then you can question, be curious about the fear. And this might be something to do in meditation, not in the moment, but look at that tendency that you might have. I'm not knowing if I'm characterizing you, Mary Jo, particularly, but just one might have in this. Question, is that fear, okay, am I in danger here? If you are, then you don't want to be there. Or is it a fear of it being just really unpleasant, and maybe you don't want to be there either, but if something's unpleasant, then you can ask yourself the question, is it maybe worth, just like, we have this metaphor, no pain, no gain in sports, not that you should put yourself in really super unpleasant situations, but things that lead to growth. Whenever we're growing, we have to stretch a little bit. And some people talk about, I was scared, but I did it scared anyway. That some degree of this kind of stuff is going to be difficult. If we're going to try to bridge those divides, there might be times when we have to step through the yuckiness that we're feeling motivated maybe by something that looks like, the pot of gold that's on the other side. And so a lot of this is going to have to do with trying to gauge what that pulling back is about, finding ways that are tractable, not going into overwhelm. You don't want to extend too far. And this is related to the compassion burnout too. If you have a good sense of self-compassion and you see that you're getting too wiped out, you got to pull back and realize you're doing too much, right? Or here with the fear, it's like, okay, I'm ready to step in to get my feet a little wet, but I'm not jumping into the deep end yet, right? So gauging that, and maybe, working with that a little bit in the safety of your own meditation on your cushion before trying it out in real life. I mean, this is something I mentioned my colleague Greg Morris, who's here. He and I are working together on developing training for helping people really embrace this common humanity so that we can heal divisions. We're trying to make it very practical because, we're running out of time. We got to solve these problems. So we all have differences. Some people are more extroverted than others. Some people are really have challenges in groups. And so learning to become familiar with yourself, compassionate for yourself and others, clear vision, and titrating what you can do. But little steps. It's like, when we're first learning to ski, you don't go on, the roughest slopes. You shouldn't. You find what are the green, blue, black diamond? I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if that helps, Mary Jo, but titrate.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's like the dynamic thrust is titration.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for your question. All right. Oh, we should go. It's about 10 after 7. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're here, I think they have like tea and cookies upstairs. Is there something like that?